Extreme weather, massive deforestation due to fire, and a historic Arctic ice shelf loss. For those on the climate change file, such events suggest the clock is ticking louder than ever. With us now for a look at the year that was, we welcome, in Victoria, British Columbia, Nathan Gillett, research scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada. In Edmonton, Alberta, Mike Flanagan, professor at the University of Alberta and scientific director of the Canadian Partnership of Wildland Fire Science. And in the nation's capital, Julia Levin, climate and energy program manager at Environmental Defense. That's a political action group. And we are delighted to welcome the three of you onto TVO tonight for a really important and timely conversation. Before we get to that conversation, we do want to show a short snippet of the documentary Borealis, which is getting its broadcast premiere tonight immediately after this program. So let's set up our conversation with a look at Borealis. Sheldon, if you would.
We've found that the warmer it gets, the more fire we have. And there's three reasons for this. The first is, the warmer it is, the longer the fire season. The warmer it gets, the more lightning we see. As we warm, the atmosphere's ability to suck moisture out of the fuel increases almost exponentially. We're seeing more fire because of human-caused climate change. And we're going to see a lot more fire.
The photography in this documentary is just stunning, both in a wonderful way and a scary way. So let's continue by reading this excerpt from the Washington Post, which goes like this. By many measures, 2020 has been disastrous. Hurricanes in the Atlantic are so numerous that there are not enough letters in the Latin alphabet to name them all. Fires in California torched more than 4 million acres, smashing the state's record for land burned in a single season. In the first 9 months of this year, at least 188 people have been killed in a record-tying 16 weather disasters that cost $1 billion or more. The nation now spends almost 10 times as much responding to and recovering from natural events as it did in the 1980s, and that's just the United States. All right, let's pick up the story from there. Mike, I want to go to you first if I can. Aside from the United States, take us on a survey of extreme weather events in Canada and the rest of the world this year. What have you been seeing?
Well, I'm a fire guy, so I'm going to concentrate on fires. And this year, we've seen unprecedented fires in Australia, the Arctic, and more recently, California. And these are destructive fires. Many people have lost their lives. Economic impacts are measured in multiple billions of dollars. The 2018 fires were measured at over $100 billion, those California fires. And this year, they're 7 to 13 billion and rising. So, I mean, these are impacts. So it's not just climate change because there's more values on the landscape. I'll give you an example, Fort McMurray fire. If that burned 100 years ago, it would have been just a natural fire. Whereas, 2016, there was a community of Fort McMurray, 88,000 people, and the cost of this natural disaster in Canadian history.
Nathan, why don't you pick up the story? What would you add to that?
Yes, so as you said, there have been extremes measured around the world this year. The World Meteorological Organization is predicting that 2020 will be the second warmest year on record. We've also seen a record low Arctic sea ice extent in the autumn. October was the lowest October Arctic sea ice extent on record. And this is part of a pattern towards a warmer climate, generally part of a long-term trend. We're seeing an increase in hot extremes. We're seeing decreasing snow and ice around the world. And as you mentioned, that Atlantic hurricane season, we saw a record number of named storms. There's research pointing to more intense hurricanes associated with climate change, and also a lot more rainfall associated with hurricanes with climate change. So most of these extremes that we're seeing are part of a pattern that we can expect associated with a warming climate.
Julia, the answer to this next question may be self-evident, but let's get it on the record nevertheless. How have these events affected the people who live in these places?
That's a really good question, because sometimes when we hear those stats, we forget that there's people on the other end of that. Just recently, I was listening to an Inuit elder speaking about her experience. And as we know, the Arctic is warming faster than most of the rest of the world. And she was telling stories about communities in the Northwest Territories where homes are falling into the Arctic Ocean because of melting permafrost and increasing erosion. She was telling stories about very experienced hunters no longer being able to safely hunt for food because of changing ice patterns. So those are the human elements that are always really important to center when we talk about the impacts of climate change.
What does that portend for them? If they can't do what they used to do the way they used to do it, therefore what?
There's so many impacts. Food security has always been, since colonization, food security in the Arctic has been a major issue, and this will only increase as local food sources become more scarce or change patterns. The housing crisis that also is an impact of colonization, it will continue to get worse. But around the world, in the Arctic, the Arctic is a very vulnerable location, but around the world, we're seeing the impacts of climate change hit the people who are the poorest and have the least amount of resilience the hardest, and the people who are least responsible for causing this crisis.
Let's continue by looking at the North, continuing to have our lens on the North. Let me put it that way. This is from a report last year that Nathan and other researchers at Environment and Climate Change Canada worked on, and I'll read an excerpt from it. Canada's climate has warmed and will warm further in the future, driven by human influence. Both past and future warming in Canada is on average about double the magnitude of global warming. Northern Canada has warmed and will continue to warm at even more than double the global rate. Nathan, let's unpack that. Why double the rate of the rest of the world?
There's several reasons for that, but one reason is that Canada is a northern country, and the Arctic is warming at a more rapid rate than the rest of the world. One reason for that is melting of snow and ice, which tends to reflect sunlight. When it goes away, more of that sunlight is absorbed, and that increases the rate of warming at the higher latitudes. Also, the land generally is warming more than the ocean. So those factors together mean that, yes, Canada has warmed and is expected to warm at about twice the rate of the globe on average.
Mike, since you're the self-described fire guy, let me put this question to you. We learned from that documentary Borealis, which, as I say, is coming up immediately after this program, that not all forest fires are bad. In fact, the forests, we learn, actually need them from time to time. What's the explanation there?
So our boreal forest has learned to survive and thrive in a regime of semi-regular, stand-renewing, stand-replacing fires. They have strategies to deal with. Some trees, like jack pine, lodgepole pine, have what we call serotinous cones. So it needs heat. It's got a waxy resin, needs heat to open. The cones release the seeds, and fire is that heat. So we're seeing fire as a natural element. Some people like to say it's good or bad, but it's just Mother Nature at work. And, you know, fire kills insects, kills disease, rejuvenates. It's the cycle of life, and it's normal. But the problem becomes if we see too much fire, then the trees cannot deal, that their strategies just cannot deal with frequent fire every 10 to 20 years, and they'll disappear. And what replaces them? Grass, shrubs, and these can burn every year. So fire's not going to disappear as long as we have the fuel to burn, the vegetation, ignition, people and lightning, and weather, hot, dry, windy, we call it. As long as we have those three ingredients, we'll continue to have fire.
Let me just ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to roll some footage here. This is of a fire in California. And Mike, I wonder, as we roll this footage, could you just explain what we're seeing here as these clouds roll across our screens?
So it's a summer day and these clouds are bubbling. That's a fire there. This could be a pyrocumulonimbus, which is a fire-generated thunderstorm. Yes, I now see the smoke on the left-hand side. And as the air rises, because fires are hot, causes the air to rise. Eventually, there's enough moisture from combustion and the lifting process, and just like your grade 3 water cycle, you get clouds forming. And if it keeps on pushing up higher and higher, you get a thunderstorm. And these can generate lightning, rain, and hail, but they're very dangerous, high-intensity fires and hard to predict. And you know, we're seeing more and more of these. And in Australia last year, there was more smoke from these cumulonimbus than we've seen from small volcanoes, and they've actually added a little bit of a cooling element to the atmosphere because the smoke blocks the solar radiation, the sunlight.
Let me just make sure I've got that expression correct. You called it pyrocumulonimbus. Is that what we just saw?
Yep, pyro-CB for short, CB being a cumulonimbus.
Got it. Okay. Nathan, let me go back to you on this. Another new study from your colleagues at Environment and Climate Change Canada outlined how rainfall levels are increasing in North America, which you would think would be a good thing, but we're also getting some extreme rainfall events as well, right? Help us understand the balance there.
That's right. So with climate change, we're seeing increased rainfall in the north in Canada, but we're also seeing an increase in extreme rainfall. So that's the days or the few days with the most intense rainfall. So that's something we're seeing on a global level, heavier extreme rainfall. And of course, that can lead to flooding, for example, in urban areas. So there are negative impacts that can come from that increased extreme rainfall.
Yeah, you were going to add something, I think?
Oh, yeah. So I was going to say that in terms of rainfall patterns generally, some parts of the globe are seeing decreases in rainfall, like the Mediterranean, to pick one example, while others are seeing increases. And these are consistent with what we're predicting with climate models. So with rainfall, basically, to simplify, the wet regions are getting wetter and the dry regions are getting drier. But also we're seeing an increase in the most extreme rainfall events.
And Julia, play it forward. Where does that ultimately take us?
I mean, if we continue on this path of climate instability, we're looking at a very scary future. I mean, that's why we're seeing so much eco-climate anxiety, especially with young people around the world. 2 years ago, the UN's leading scientists put out a report that detailed the difference between a 1.5 degree warming scenario and a 2 degree warming scenario. And half a degree might not sound like a big deal, but in climatic terms, it's huge. The differences were incredibly significant. So what this tells us is we need to take rapid action now.
Mike, one more question on the issue of the fires, and that is, I know you're not a big fan of this, or at least I hear you're not a big fan of this expression that the Amazon are the lungs of the planet. But take us there and tell us what's been going on through the past year, through 2020, in terms of campaigns to take down even more trees in the Amazon. What's happening?
So the Amazon is different than what we've seen in Australia and California and the Arctic, where those fires were either started by lightning or were accidental. What's happening in the Amazon is they're clearing the land for agriculture and ranching. And so these are deliberately set, and the government is actually encouraging this. And yes, I'd like to say the boreal is the lungs of the world, but the Amazon is critically important as well. And if it goes from a rainforest to a cerrado or a savanna, this is really bad news climatologically as well as for the species of the rainforest. So the Brazilian government's encouraging this, and it's really a disaster that entirely preventable.
Well, since you deal with empirically provable facts, let's get this on the record here as well. In terms of the lungs of the world, it's really more the borealis or it's more the Amazon rainforest?
They're both playing major roles. I would argue that the boreal is more important because it's the largest forest that we have that has largely been undisturbed, except for the southern fringes, mostly in North America. So the boreal is critically important, and we could lose it with climate change. It's hard to imagine, but the boreal forest as we know it could be lost in 50, 100 years.
All right. Julia, I wonder if you could pick up the story, because there's been a great deal of conversation about the impact on the environment that this pandemic has had. There's a lot less driving going on, a lot less people going into work, a lot less of all of the things that used to pollute our planet quite a bit. Can you tell us how the sum total of all of that has affected the environment to the best of your knowledge?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So as people are driving less, not flying nearly as much, and just leading lives that are less carbon intensive, we've actually seen a decrease in emissions by about 7%. And that's really interesting because the the UN scientists are telling us that's how much we need to decrease our emissions every year until 2030 to ensure that we have a climate stable future. So what that's really telling us is that individual actions, while important, can only go so far. And what we really need is structural change.
Okay, more on that in a bit, but I still want to understand the impact of cleaner skies over Beijing and how that may or may not have an impact on us. Nathan, can you pick up the story there? We've all seen some pretty amazing pictures of, for example, the skyline in Los Angeles, which, you know, for the first time in a long time, you can see, or in Beijing, which you can see. Does that have an impact on us here in Canada?
Well, that's a good question, and that's a topic that we've been looking at here in Environment and Climate Change Canada. As Julia said, the carbon dioxide emissions have gone down about 7% this year. We have also seen decreases in emissions of soot, of other polluting substances, and there have been some observations of increased air quality, cleaner air. But in terms of the long-term impacts on climate change, it has a small effect. The effect of especially carbon dioxide, it's the cumulative total of the carbon dioxide that's emitted over time that's driving climate change. So if we just emit a bit less one year, that's not going to have a very big effect. And as Julia said, if we want to meet these long-term goals in the Paris Agreement, 1.5 degrees, then yes, it's correct that we need to make decreases in emissions year on year over time to have a substantial and kind of noticeable impact on climate.
Understood. I'm going to have our director, Sheldon Osmond, bring up a picture now. This is 6 different hurricanes during the course of this record year for hurricanes. And as the maps suggest, I'll read it in some detail here because those listening on podcast can't see. They're all set to hit Louisiana. Louisiana is really, I mean, talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Julia, start us off on this. How does a place recover from that much dramatic weather?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to that question. I think one of the things that we're seeing when communities are hit by devastating natural disasters is that the way they recover is not always equitable. It doesn't always put at the center the people who are most vulnerable. And that's something we need to change going forwards, because we know storms like this are going to get more frequent. Even if we take dramatic action today, and we really have to do that, we've still put enough carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we're still going to see worsening impacts. The climate is still going to get more unstable as we go forward. And so part of this ties back to just how we recover from COVID and what we're doing to make sure that our societies are not just more sustainable and we're not just taking actions that improve us from a climate resiliency perspective, but we're also building more just and more equitable societies to repair some of those historic damages.
Mike, can I get you to weigh in on that? How does Louisiana keep coming back over and over from all of the environmental degradation that it's sustained over the last many years?
So recovery, it's part of the emergency management phases. And, there are some things that we can do: adaptation, mitigation, preparedness, and prevention. But you can't prevent a hurricane, but we can prevent climate change. And it needs global action to reduce greenhouse gases. But a lot of people may not realize that even if we stop producing greenhouse gases today, the Earth is going to continue to warm for the next 50 to 60 years because of all the heat's been absorbed by the ocean, which has time lags of up to 1,000 years. So this warming is going to continue, and we're going to see more extremes. And I'm the fire guy, so extremes drive the fire business. California, 1% of the fires burn 99% of the area burned. Canada, 3% of the fires burn 97% of the area burned. And these happen on a few critical days. And just like hurricanes last a week or two, we're talking about events, and we're seeing more extreme events, and we expect to see more in the future.
Is that to say, Nathan, that these so-called once-in-a-100-year events we are going to be seeing more and more frequently for the next 5 decades, even if we got our act together today, which we're not, but even if. Is that right?
Yes, in the big picture, that is right. Hot extremes, extremes associated with heavy rainfall, the most intense hurricanes, tropical cyclones, these are all extremes that we expect to intensify going into the future. In terms of what our action now means, it's true that, even if we start reducing emissions now, we can expect additional warming, but the decisions that we make now will have a big effect later in the century, by 2050, by 2100. If we start reducing emissions, and if we are able to reduce emissions to zero by the middle of the century, we will limit climate change to a level that 1.5 of 2 degrees, we will avoid the worst impacts of climate change. If, in contrast, we continue to emit at the present level or increase, then we can expect a much more severe impacts towards the mid and end of the century. So our action now does make a difference.
Well, I started this conversation by saying that it was obviously important, but also timely. And timely because the federal government, of course, has just announced its plans on climate change. And let's bring up, Sheldon, if you would, we're in the middle of page 5. Let's bring up some of the stats on this, and then we'll get some feedback from our guests. The goal is to reduce total annual greenhouse gas emissions to 503 megatons by the year 2030. If we go back a couple of years, there were 729 megatons. So we want to go from 729 to 503, and we've got 10 years to do it. They're talking $15 billion in investment of green technologies, the move to gradually increase the carbon tax on fuel from $30 a ton this year to $170 a ton in 10 years' time. We've heard something from the Premier of Ontario about how he's not a fan of that idea. To offset the increased cost of gas and home heating, there will be new quarterly rebates to Canada's households. And there's a net zero challenge for large industrial emitters to transition their facilities to net zero emissions. They're giving 30 years for this to happen. So that's got to be done by the year 2050. All right, let's get some feedback. Julia, in your view, what does this plan announced by the federal government this week, what does it get right?
It does get a lot right. I mean, for the first time in Canadian history, we have a credible and modeled plan to reach a climate target, and that's a really important precedent that it's setting. It also has large investments in the areas we need to be investing in, whether they be electrifying transportation, energy efficiency, building renewable power generation. Those are all part of the solutions package. That being said, the 2030 target that this achieves, like you showed, it's a 30% reduction. And what we know, that's only half of where Canada actually needs to be to align with the science, to do our fair share, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We need to be reducing our emissions by 60%. So while this is a strong step in the right direction by providing a credible modeled plan, we need to double our ambition. This target was set 5 years ago. We've had 5 years to develop a plan. Real ambition now means a 60% reduction by 2030.
All right, if we're going to go from the 30% reduction that the government has outlined to 60%, which is what you say we need, how do we get there?
That's a great question. So what this climate plan hinges on is the carbon price. And that's smart. Economists around the world agree almost universally that the price on pollution is the most cost-effective way to reduce emissions. And it will get us part of the way, but it doesn't get us the whole way. So like I said, we need even larger investments into energy efficiency, into electrifying everything, into making sure the grid that provides that electricity is powered by renewable energy sources. But we also need to reconcile a problematic contradiction that exists right now in Canada, where governments that want to be climate leaders claim to be climate leaders on one hand, but they are also putting in policies, giving billions of dollars towards expanding the fossil fuel sector. Producing and burning fossil fuels is what causes climate change. So in order to tackle our emissions in a meaningful way, we need to have an honest conversation in this country about what phasing out fossil fuels looks like, and making sure that we're doing that in a way that's equitable to the workers and communities that are in that sector today.
Well, we happen to have somebody from Alberta on the line with us here. Mike, how would that play in the province you're in right now?
Well, like many parts of the country, there are people with different views on topics like climate change and carbon tax. But carbon tax works, okay? The federal government has had a lousy track record for meeting our commitments. So I think this is a good start, and we need to do more. And you just have to look around the world where combustion engine vehicles are being eliminated in various countries. It's only a matter of time before we have to go green, but there's a transition period, and we can use geothermal and some of the engineering technology and experience we have in Alberta to move towards renewables, and that's where we should be going.
Nathan, you're an employee of Environment and Climate Change Canada, so I don't want to put you in a sticky spot on this, but are you able to weigh in on whether you think these targets go far enough?
Well, I think I certainly will comment on them. I think the fact that there's a commitment to reach net zero emissions by 2050 is important. And as I said before, it's the cumulative total of carbon dioxide that's emitted that controls the amount of warming. So if we want to stabilize climate, then we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to zero. So I think it's important that that is part of the plan, and that moving to zero emissions globally is consistent with meeting by the middle of the century, is consistent with limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees. Just also to comment on the international context, I think it's good to see that other countries around the world are introducing these commitments to reach zero emissions. And I think that is definitely what we need to do if we want to limit climate change, if we want to stabilize climate.
Julia, it's funny. I'm on my iPhone here because I was looking for the fundraising e-blast that the Premier of Ontario put out yesterday. Of course, I can't find it now that I'm looking for it. But the Premier of Ontario put out an e-blast yesterday to Progressive Conservative Party supporters. And essentially, the text of the e-blast was, have you seen what the federal government is doing on the carbon tax? They want to raise it from $30 to $170. This is a terrible time, given the nature of the economy, the state of the economy, to be raising taxes. I'm opposed to this. If you're with me, send me $5, send me $20, whatever. Can I ask what your views are on that appeal?
I mean, anyone sending the appeal would be losing more money on the fundraising appeal than they will to a price on carbon. What the government has approached carbon pricing in a smart way. The consumer price on carbon, so what we'll see, the increase we'll see on heating our homes, driving gas cars, we will get more than that back through rebates that the government will provide. And they're going, right now, that rebate is provided in our taxes. So lots of people might not even know they're getting money back. But what they're doing now is that they're going to be sending a rebate quarterly every 3 months. So you're actually getting the money back before you even spend it. So this won't cost anyone in this country money, or the vast majority of people will be better off with the rebates than the increase they're going to be seeing on what they're spending. So all of this opposition that we're seeing is really just untrue, and it's very irresponsible. We need our provincial governments to really start to use the levers that exist at the provincial level and stop blocking climate action.
Mike, forgive me, I'm literally down to my last 30 seconds on this, but I do want to ask this question. We have witnessed in this past year an unprecedented coming together of governments all over the world to fight this coronavirus. That notably has not happened when it comes to climate change. How infuriating is that to you?
Well, it's frustrating. Like Julia mentioned earlier, we need urgent action now. I teach a class, and a colleague of mine wrote a paper in the late 90s saying we need urgent action now to deal with climate change. And here we are saying the same thing 20 years later. So it is time for urgent action.
Nathan, Mike, and Julia, I want to thank you very much for coming on to TVO tonight and helping us out with this. Much appreciated, and be well.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.